Hi, and welcome to this section of the tutor where we're going to continue again working with fractions, and in this section we're going to learn about how to divide fractions. The good news is that if you know how to multiply fractions, which is what we covered in the last section there, dividing fractions is really easy. It's really almost exactly the same thing as multiplying fractions. So if you don't know how to multiply them really well, go back and watch that section. But once you know that material, this material is going to be a piece of cake, I promise you. So what we want to do is we want to look at some problems that would look something like this. If you had 1/6 and you were dividing by 1/2, okay? 1/6 divided by 1/2. Well, let's rewrite that a little bit and I'll show you what they're really asking. You have 1/6, which is just a number, don't forget, and I'm dividing by, which is what this big bar means, I'm dividing by 1/2, okay? So here I've got 1/6 divided by 1/2. Here I've got 1/6 divided by 1/2. I'm just showing you what they're really asking you to do. I'm kind of writing it in a different form, okay? 1/6 divided by 1/2, okay? The way in which you do division of fractions is very simple. You just take the top number, 1/6, and you change this division, which is this big line here, into multiplication. But when you do that, so you change it into multiplication, so you put a big dot here, that means multiplication. But you're not going to multiply by 1/2, you're going to multiply and you're going to flip this fraction over. So you're going to multiply by 2/1, okay? Now I know that may not make a whole lot of sense, but that's really what you're doing. We'll go back and talk about this part in a minute. Let's go ahead and finish the problem. Now that it's a simple multiplication problem, you just multiply the top two numbers. 1 times 2 gives you 2. And the bottom two numbers, 6 times 1 gives you 6. And then just like any problem with anything, you always check and see if you can simplify it. And here you can, because you can divide by 2 and you can divide by 2. Okay? 2 divided by 2 is going to give you 1. 6 divided by 2 is going to give you 3. Okay? So that's the answer, 1/3. Notice that from here on, it was just a simple multiplication problem. You just multiply the top, multiply the bottom, simplify the fraction, and that's it. The only thing that you need to know here is when you're dividing, okay, you take the top number, and then you change this division into a multiplication, and then you take the bottom fraction and you flip it over, which is what we did here. 1/2 became 2/1, and then you can multiply them. So you see, division and multiplication are kind of almost opposites of one another, and they're almost exactly the same. And once you start, okay, with the division, you can change it into multiplication by taking that bottom fraction and flipping it over, and then you can multiply. So it's really not very hard, okay? And I'm trying to build up to it here and kind of teach you the things that you're going to need to know. But what if you had something like 2/7, again, divided by 1/2? Well, it helps me when I'm writing it down to go ahead and write it as 2/7 all divided by 1/2. Which is just a number divided by another number, okay? It helps me because whenever I write this down, I can write it as 2/7 times, changing it into a multiplication. I take this bottom fraction, flip it over, and write it over here, 2/1. 1/2 becomes 2/1, okay? Now, you don't really need to write this down. I mean, you could start from here and you could just write this first number down, put a multiplication, and flip the second number down. That's fine. It's just, I get in the habit of doing it this way. It's just something for me, mainly. So then you just go and take the top two numbers. 2 times 2 will give you 4, okay? And the bottom number times the other number is 7 times 1 is going to give you 7. So 4/7 is the answer. There's nothing more I can do to simplify, so you're done. So division of fractions really isn't that hard, but it does give a lot of people a lot of problems at first. Okay? So what I like to do again is I like to write 5/8 on the top, all divided by, and then 3/4 on the bottom. Okay, you don't have to write this, but I like to do it. And then finally, to solve the problem, 5/8 times, take this bottom fraction, flip it over, so it's going to be 4/3. So you take the bottom fraction, flip it over, and change it to multiplication. So it's real easy. 5 times 4 is going to give you 20. Okay? And 8 times 3 is going to give you 24. So like anything else, you need to go and say, well, can I simplify this anymore? Can I do anything special with this? Okay. Well, you can divide the top and the bottom by 4. Okay, and when we do that, I believe it's going to simplify the problem here. So I think we can simplify this. 20 divided by 4 is going to be 5, and that's just because 5 times 4 gives you 20. And over here, 24 divided by 4 is going to give you 6, simply because 4 times 6 gives you 24. So you're going to have 5/6 as the answer. But notice from here on over to the right, it's exactly the same as the last section, which is just a bunch of problems in multiplication. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of problems in this section. We're going to do a few more here. But because it's so very simple, I mean so very similar, that's what I meant to say, to multiplication, we're just going to do a few problems to kind of get us in the hang of it. 3/5 divided by 2/3. Okay? And I like to write 3/5 on the top, all divided by 2/3. So I'm just rewriting the problem here. So now in order to go on, I just write 3/5 times, take this bottom number and flip it over, 3/2. Just flip it over like this. And I can change it into multiplication. So then 3 times 3 gives me 9, that's on the top. 5 times 2 gives me 10, which is on the bottom. So the answer is 9/10. And there's nothing more I can do here to simplify. There's nothing I can divide by that's going to make that any simpler. So what if I had 9/11 divided by 7/8? Well, that's just going to be 9/11 divided by 7/8. In order to change the problem to multiplication, I just write 9/11 times, and over here, 8/7. I take this over and I flip it over like this. Now, 8 times 9 here is 72, and 11 times 7 is 77. So 72/77. We have one last problem here, which is going to be 4/5 divided by 5/6. Okay, so what I'm going to have here is 4/5 multiplied by, and I'm going to take the second fraction, flip it over, it's going to be 6/5. And then at this point I just do it like multiplication. 6 times 4 gives me 24, and 5 times 5 gives you 25. So the answer is 24/25, and there's nothing more I can really do to simplify that anymore. So dividing fractions, we didn't do that many problems here, and that is because dividing fractions really and truly is the same thing as multiplying them. So once you know how to go back and do the multiplication section, which we've already talked about, multiplication becomes really, really easy. You just take the first number that you start with in the problem, and then you change the division to multiplication. You take the second fraction and flip it over, and then you just treat it exactly like a multiplication problem. And that is how you divide fractions.